Oops. Is that it? Oh, thank you. Welcome all. Thank you for attending tonight. I think we're really fortunate to have Chris here with us, Chris Timbs from Barry Simons, and we know that this has been coming. The reforms to the RMA. Everyone's very nervous about what the end of the year is going to look like and what will be kept and what will not be. But I think there's still a lot there in the grounding of these documents that Chris will take us through and give us a little bit of forewarning, a little bit of armour in our knowledge on how to deal with these, how to advise our clients. So I won't pretend to be an expert on it. I'll pass it to Chris. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me. I'm a lawyer. I'm a director at Barry Simons. We're a boutique law firm, and I don't profess to be completely across the RMA amendments either. I made a comment to someone earlier. If someone says they've actually read every single document that's been popped out, I'd probably challenge them on that. It is huge. It is a tome. It's a massive change to our environmental law. It's the only environmental law I've ever known, although some of you may have been around slightly longer than me. But we're in for a whole sea change, and that's the purpose of the presentation tonight, a whole new world. And it is coming. This presentation it's a high-level one. It's targeted at the audience, which are the architects in the room. I've tried not to dive into any detail around statute provisions, exactly how things read. It very much is an overview. But if you do have any questions and want any further detail on anything, happy to talk through that. We can take questions. And if I don't know the answer, I can go away and find it. So happy with that. I think we will have questions potentially halfway through. I'll try and find a point if anything's come up through the first half of the presentation, which is a broader overview of the change and where we've got to before we deep dive into some of the more relevant matters for yourselves. But equally, if there's something that you have a burning question about as we work through it, let me know and I'll do my best to answer it. So, resource management, a whole new world. Beginning, I'm sure you're all semi-familiar with the RMA. It's been around a long time. It's been under pressure. It was enacted over 30 years ago now. You'll be well aware it's been heavily amended since then. I think at last count it was almost amended once a year since it was first enacted in 1991. And we ended up with this weighty tome. It's one of the larger pieces of legislation that we have. There's been an ongoing commentary, and I would say persistent commentary, that's perhaps got more vocal in the last 5 or 6 years, that it hasn't achieved its purpose. It unduly restricts development. You'll hear the reference to red tape thrown out all the time in the media and by the politicians, and that it's not fit for purpose in its current state. Personally, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I take a slight issue with that. There are a number of tools in the RMA that do work. Whether the RMA itself is the problem or how those tools are utilised, I think is another question, and that was a debate that's been had for the last 3 or 4 years, particularly since the predecessor amendment, the Natural Built and Environment Act, was proposed, or bill, came in. But everyone takes a slightly different view on that, depending on where you sit and depending on how you work and who you work with. So the case for reform, there were government concerns expressed about complexity, cost and inconsistencies. It was seen as a perceived barrier to housing, infrastructure and productive activity, and there was a need for fewer plans, fewer consents and stronger national consistency. The genesis of this was actually in a national environmental standard, I think it was, which tried to bring in consistent terminology, how plans are described, how plan maps work, and consistent zoning. And that was a number of years ago. Sorry, I don't have the exact date. And the idea is that we want everyone to be able to look at a plan, look at a set of plan provisions and work out what we can do, and you don't have to jump between different areas and different plan rules in different parts of the country. And so that led to what was seen to be a great emphasis on certainty, proportionality and property rights. And I'll come back to the property rights point. And there was seen to be a need for an ongoing protection of environmental values and hazard management. I don't really touch on that today, but that's a big part of the reform as well. So what's happened? One law's become two. We've got a planning bill and a natural environment bill. The planning bill, land use, infrastructure, hazards, heritage matters. The natural environment bill, air, water, soil limits, environmental limits, I should say, biodiversity considerations. Separate legislation, but they interact. If you've ever dealt with a district plan and a regional plan, sort of a similar thing. For those of you, we're all Auckland-based here, I think. You'll all be used to working under the unitary plan. That's a combined regional and district plan. Other parts of the country, they're obviously split out. And when you're working on a project, particularly if you're the architectural component of that, you might have a project that covers off architectural matters, which is the district plan provisions. Then you may also be jumping into regional planning provisions, and that's the environmental bill matters. There's a push here for stronger national direction and a much greater emphasis on spatial plans, and I'll touch on those again shortly. But the national direction is important, and this is sort of leading into this slide here. Sorry, the images are a little bit hard to read. These are taken from some not MFE anymore, it's the Ministry for, it's MCERT, sorry. The environment's in there, but we've amalgamated a number of ministries. The current RMA system, it's always been viewed like a triangle, skinny end at the top, large base at the bottom. We have the RMA and it all filters down. And the idea behind that was devolved decision making. So we have legislation, we have some national direction, we have regional policy statements, and the idea was that we devolve the nitty gritty and the decisions on the ground down to a regional and local government level. The new system is changing that. It's almost inverting the triangle. We've actually got the base at the top and the pointy end at the bottom. Sorry, technical term. We have a much stronger emphasis on national policy directions and national standards, including limits. And then these will feed down into combined plans, which will combine environment plans and land use plans and also the overarching spatial plan. And then you'll have consents and permits, similar to what you have now, both district and regional, and probably district consents in terms of what you usually deal with. But there's going to be less consents, and the idea is to create a more permissive regime because you've done a lot of the front-end, top-end work in deciding what effects are acceptable and what are not acceptable and what matters can be considered at a national level rather than a local and a regional level. And that's really the fundamental change here. I'm not going to spend long on this slide. This is another description of the proposed system, just in a bit more detail. And again, you can follow through and see the overarching purpose and goals that feeds into your national direction and your instruments. And then this is where I was discussing the combined plan. You have your spatial plan that sits below that, your land use plan, your natural environment plans, and then you have your consenting processes. Again, everything feeds into this. So if this is wrong, or if there's something at a national level or on a national instrument or a national direction that you're not in agreement with, or you don't like, or you think may influence an outcome at the bottom end that perhaps is an outcome, I don't want to say you don't like, but an outcome that is undesirable, the chance to address that at the consenting stage at the bottom is now going to be far reduced. People are going to need to get involved at the top end and influence the national direction because once that's in place, that's in place. And that's, again, something that I think is going to take some time for, experts in various disciplines, lawyers even, planners, and particularly the public to get their head around. We've always operated on an assumption that you can kind of come in at a consenting stage and have a real good crack at a lot of different things, rightly or wrongly. those rights are going to be curtailed. So same but different. We're moving away from a single sustainable management test, which has guided the RMA. Each bill's got its own purpose, goals and procedural principles. Like I've just talked about, we're going to have a lot more policy choices resolved at a national level and strategic level at the top end. And so consenting advocacy will become narrower and tied to prescribed standards, and I'll touch on this in a bit more detail later on. So the two bills, just to highlight the planning bill, this is the purpose of the bill that I've put in quotes here. Some themes behind the bill: we prevent unreasonable effects on others. As you'll probably appreciate as architects, what someone sees as an unreasonable effect, everyone's got a slightly different view on that. The purpose is to have well-functioning urban and rural areas and competitive land markets, and there's a presumption that land use activities are permitted. And where has this come from? It's come from the enshrining of private property rights. So this is a real push and a theme that's come through. I've taken this quote here. The first sentence is the purpose, and the second sentence: central to this purpose is the recognition of private property rights, where the presumption is that people can use their land without unnecessary constraints. And this has come from a Ministry for the Cities, Environment, Regions and Transport is what it's now called. It's a tongue twister. A guidance document that was just published at the end of last week. They had a statement, not government policy, illustrative draft material, so I've put that on there just to be clear. This is what's driven the entire change. So, covering my bases. The Natural Environment Bill, just briefly, this is like your regional plan that I mentioned earlier, probably less relevant to architectural matters. This is the use, protection, enhancement of the natural environment, your water, your air, your soils, your Indigenous biodiversity. This will all be dealt with via prescribed environmental limits. Again, these will come in at a national level. They have been used in New Zealand for a wee while now. Not all over. They're particularly relevant to water take and use. And there was a whole lot of back and forth on freshwater limits. Some of you may recall the discussions about swimmable rivers and streams, wadable streams. Because of the interrelationship, similar to the present scenario, a building might be acceptable on land use terms, but still be constrained by one of these other environmental considerations, but likely less relevant for your urban design type matters. This is coming back to some of my points earlier. We've got an emphasis now on a top-down approach. I won't go through that, but this is where we are going, and you can see the points here. I do personally think the standardised terminology and plan content is very helpful. Despite being a lawyer, it means that once we have some settled provisions, maybe once they've been discussed in the context of a hearing or a courtroom, we may be able to resolve what those mean, and then we have some consistency across the country. I don't think that's a bad thing. The only downside is the local consideration of specific matters. That's the harder one, but there's always going to be a trade-off. Spatial plans, I don't know how familiar everyone here is with spatial plans or the spatial planning process. These have been utilised, and these are going to form a key component of the new system. They are already in place in some areas of the country. We also have FDSs or future development strategies as well, but these will have some legislative teeth. This is a screenshot, some of you may recognise it, it's down in Drury, where there's a whole lot of development going on, and this is the kind of thing that spatial plans are designed to address. What do we want, where do we want it, and again at a high level, not a prescriptive level, a high level, where's your infrastructure going, where's your urban development going, where's your commercial areas going. These now take on some fairly critical importance, and this is why the last bullet point's important. These strategic trade-offs occur earlier. So early participation matters. If you have clients or large institutional clients that you do work for that want to put buildings and development in certain areas, in greenfields areas in particular, it's highly likely that they want to be active and engaged in the spatial planning process. It was previously seen as a sort of a nice to do, but not a necessary thing to do, largely because you got almost no time to present a submission, and they didn't legislatively bite as hard. But now it's something that you're going to have to think about and look at. And this is not so much on the ground, but it's looking at a future strategy, a future development strategy for a client. The changes will chop down the number of plans. We're going to go from 100 existing plans down to 17 regional combined plans. As mentioned, it'll have the spatial plan at a high level, the natural environment plan and the district level land use plan. Less duplication, greater integration, and a more consistent structure. And this is a soundbite that often gets thrown out. We're reducing the number of documents, we're making it easier. I've said here, fewer documents, not necessarily fewer controls. You can reduce the number of documents, but they're still going to be large documents. And I suspect there's going to be a whole lot of internal inconsistencies and hierarchies that need to be discussed and argued about. So, yeah, 6 one way, half a dozen the other. The commonality in coming away from bespoke rules will be helpful. I've mentioned that already, but an example of now, I tried to think of what national standards you may deal with in the day-to-day, and happy to be corrected if there's more. A recent good example is the Granny Flats National Environmental Standard that came out November last year. And I'm sure some of you have looked at it or touched on it, which is that enabling national standard for a 70 square metre, I think it's a minor dwelling. And that ran roughshod over all of the planning provisions that previously applied. So it's an example of how national level direction through a standard, alternative policy statement, can be used to direct how things have to happen on the ground at a local level. The point there is some people will agree with it, some people won't, and everyone will have an example of it. I don't want a granny flat going in next door, but that's the kind of thing that these national standards are supposed to do, make it easier, and that's where the amendments are going. There's an opportunity here. You have transferable knowledge around the country. Your due diligence work you do in one area is probably going to be applicable to another area. That's great. It's an efficiency both for your work, it's an efficiency for your clients, but you have less influence on a local design response. So where does that leave us, and what can decision makers consider? And this is where we start to look at what is likely to affect you. We're explicitly narrowing the scope of the relevant effects. So what the front end of the planning bill has is a section that says you must disregard certain effects. And this is tied back to one point in particular, which is that enshrinement of private property rights. And you can see some of the exclusions here. Internal layouts of buildings, external layouts where effects stay on site, visual amenity matters, views from private property. Good design, I think, still matters, but not all effects resulting from a design outcome or a proposed development will be relevant effects for a decision maker to consider. I don't think decision makers are going to have a tough time grappling with this. We already discuss what effects are in and are out from their consideration based on case law, or how the planning provisions are worded, or how the RMA has been worded. So that's not a new conversation. The key change here is this is an explicit section in the new bill, and it's very clear, subject to a couple of points that I will talk to. This, you won't be able to read it. This is the clause I was talking about, a whole lot of effects. The bullet points that are excluded from consideration, these effects on the right: building layouts, character, appearance, aesthetic qualities of the use, development or the building, the type of residence to be housed. I know where that will have come from. Views from private property and landscape effects, unless you're an O&L or a high natural character area. So we've dropped into a system where there's less consideration of effects, perhaps an easier consenting process. So how does the assessment still work? Well, to be fair, still the same as currently. You'll be looking at if the activity is permitted. If it's not, do you need a consent? What consent do you need? What effects are relevant? Do national standards or specific protections apply? And that's particularly tied to the Natural Environment Bill. And I think the last point, there's going to be less urban design and architecture evidence or input and more front-end due diligence. And that's because of the scope of effects that are now out, we are no longer going to be having the discussions around broader amenity concerns and character, which has necessarily always been a number of subjective assessments which are overlaid with an objective viewpoint. And to be frank, as a lawyer, they are fairly hard to argue and fairly hard to run, mainly because of that subjective-objective component. So the change has actually made it a whole lot easier, I think, in saying, well, those are all out now. Whether that's good for an opponent versus an applicant, two different things. Will my project still need consent? Maybe. It depends on what it is. The intention is no, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it won't. I think in urban areas and existing urban areas, and where you have areas that are subject to the planning bill rather than the protections through the Natural Environment Bill, it will be easier. We do have fewer activity categories, and so rather than the 7 consenting activities, including the non-complying one, which is always problematic if you've ever dealt with a non-complying resource consent, we have permitted, restricted, discretionary, and prohibited, as I understand it. So there's going to be a lot more scope, rather than having an argument and a discussion around various matters at the consenting stage based on your consenting activity. You're more likely going to be looking at, well, what are the prescriptive rules in place, and can I essentially get not a deemed approval, but is my project or my development approved as a result of my compliance review of what those prescriptive provisions say, rather than heading off to a resource consent hearing and a discretionary decision maker assessing everything and determining whether to grant or decline consent. I don't think this is going to... Oh, sorry, the fourth point here, no resource consent will not prevent a project because it's more permissive, and that's that compliance-based approval rather than a discretionary decision. And I think this is actually going to be a clear benefit to architects. You'll be able to spend more time designing and developing and drawing buildings rather than justifying why you've done what you've done, although maybe still to the client, but rather than to a decision maker. There are a number of controls that will still shape your design and have what I think is quite a big influence on architecture matters. Natural hazards, historic heritage, various landscape effects will all still remain material. Less of an importance, particularly landscape effects in Auckland, but obviously down in the South Island, a key consideration, particularly in Central Otago, Queenstown areas. Under the new system, you should be looking at these constraints as soon as possible. You'd be at risk if you just sort of assume, oh, we've got a more permissive regime coming in, I've looked at the planning bill, all these effects are excluded, let's just crack on and design whatever the client wants us to design. There are still a number of matters that will inform what you design and perhaps where you design it on a site. And the flooding, coastal and land instability things, hazards, has become more and more prominent in the last 3 years. So where does that take us to in terms of using the new system, there's going to be a long transitional consenting process. The RMA is not going to hear one day, gone the next, disappear overnight is what I was trying to say. Transitional consenting begins 1 month after the new bills pass into law. They had their third reading, I think, at the end of last week. They've all been through the select committee. It's really a fait accompli as to when they become law. They're not going to go through any further changes. There's been articles on that today. And we expect them to come out from Parliament in the next week or two, subject to parliamentary sitting days. There is some election uncertainty, but again, there's been articles released and commentary from the two of the opposing political parties, both Labour and the Greens, saying even if this bill comes in, which it will, and we get elected, we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That happened with the NBA. Some of you may be familiar with it. And I don't think there's the political appetite or the public appetite for that to happen again. So there seems to be a little bit more certainty this time round. So what happens if you're working under these transitional provisions? New applications will continue under a modified RMA process. There's some transitional national rules that may apply and some effects may drop away. I listened to a presentation from the ministry last week and they are still working through both applying existing national environmental standards and policy statements to the new regime, and they're updating wording in those, and there's new ones coming out. So that really is you're going to have to keep an eye on what's popping out of the ministry. It's changing all the time and they're constantly being updated. In terms of notification, you may have all been in a process where there's an argument or a dispute over a contested project or a contested development or a contested building, and there are arguments about who should be notified and who should have the ability to have a say on the proposal. Those notification provisions are also been fairly significantly curtailed. The special circumstances scenario is gone, and the same effects that I talked about earlier has been removed from consideration will also disappear from notification considerations as well. Councils may have to have regard to a completed spatial plans. There's not many of those around at the moment, but they've been developed, and you're going to need to confirm which regime applies on your application date. There's savings provisions, and if you apply before the transitional regime bites, then you're under the old RMA for the entirety of your consenting process, no matter how long it takes. So we're coming back to the effects, and Section 104, which is one of the engine rooms of the RMA, and sets out how decision makers must consider decisions, determine decisions, what's in, what's out, what's relevant. The amendment that comes into that through the transitional provisions in a month's time or so is that they must disregard all of these points, which is broadly consistent with the operative clause at the front end of the planning bill that I touched on. However, it's not quite as broad, I think in part because they've decided that these matters are critical to keep things moving now under the existing district plans and in the existing provisions, but that broader scope of non-relevant effects will come in down the track. But these are all still critical. The one that's of particular interest to me, and it's something that gets talked about a lot, is views from private property. I've looked at the wording and I've asked myself, well, does this work both ways? The wording is views from private property. There's no reference to an applicant's site. There's no reference to a neighbouring site. This is in the statutory language. I've taken a position indicative only that a reasonable interpretation is that all views of a development from any private property are excluded. Some people might take a different view to that, but that's my interpretation at present. And naturally, you can see a scenario in which some sites are more vulnerable to this than others, particularly based on geography and topography. overlooking privacy, dominance, visual amenity as a result of views is frequently discussed, frequently argued about. I've been involved in projects where you're constantly going back to your architect and or your urban designer to refine what a building looks like, where it's located. Are we taking a bit off here? Are we taking a deck off here? Are we taking a roof off here? Are we changing a roof line here? And that's to get around these types of effects. That's going to go. I just had a couple of examples here. These are just taken from Stuff articles recently. Controversial high-rise in Mount Victoria, a retirement village. I think this is the one down near Lower Hutt. Again, these are the kinds of projects that frequently attracted objections as a result of views and privacy. That effect will go. Great if you're doing work for a developer, not so good if you're doing work for a neighbour or an opponent. So again, it's all swings and roundabouts, but this is the genesis. These effects and the exclusion of these effects are the genesis behind some of the amendments here, and particularly behind a lot of these amendments to the planning bill, which remove these effects. I had to think about whether anything could go. Don't hate me if someone knows about this one in the middle. I think it was designed by an architect in Wellington, and I knew someone was going to pick it up.
I'm having lunch with him on Monday.
Oh, brilliant. Don't tell him I put his building up on the slide, please. A unique design.
Is that the Britain House?
Yeah, I think it is. Maybe not to everyone's taste, but exactly the kind of design that you would perhaps expect to see an objection to if someone built it next door. I think the top left is from Motueka, and the right is a fairly standard set of townhouses. So, again, probably quite good for architects because you can have a little bit more design freedom with what you're doing and not expect to end up in a hearing talking about what it looks like.
Thanks for the conversation.
That's all right. Good talking point, yeah. Great design. I personally love it.
You must be a lawyer.
So what does this mean for projects already in the pipeline? Treat your consented projects, your extant applications and your early design stage work separately. For live applications and your design stage work, you're going to need to ensure that all the relevant provisions and the incoming provisions are identified, whether that relates to national standards or the effects that are going to be disregarded. Determine whether this affects your design and consider your overall consenting strategy and your risk. And then you're going to need to decide whether to seek consent under the transitional provisions and how to do that. I think mostly you're going to land in a place which says, well, you're not going to have it seems that there's going to be little risk in waiting for the transitional provisions to come in, given it's likely only, in real terms, 6 or 7 weeks away, to lodge an application after that date to get the benefit of the reduced scope of effects. Of course, that's sometimes dependent on the client, depending on commercial considerations. And you're going to have to ask yourself what's actually contributing to the consenting risk. And does the timing assist the project and the architect's input and the design of a building, whatever it is one piece of that. Usually you'll be with a suite of experts and there's a whole lot of things to consider. So I'd suggest wait. If you think you're going to have a battle about appearance, character, amenity effects, sit tight. Those are going to be narrowed. I think wait for their transitional provisions. If it's not related to those points and it's something to do with, hazards, landscape, environmental limits, those controls are still going to apply. There seems a little benefit in waiting. It's going to be site specific, but it is something that you should be turning your mind to now, particularly with live projects or client inquiries. You may still have a benefit from proceeding with projects where they're designed around an existing planning or legal framework, and the client's put a whole lot of work into a design solution that comprehensively addresses all of those issues. There are some advantages there. There's certainty, there's a clear consenting pathway. We've got a whole lot of case law. That's probably going to be a discussion with if it's a contentious project, with the commercial realities of the client and the planner and the lawyer, if there's a lawyer involved, and maybe the engineers. But you definitely want to wait, I think, if you've got a project that's subject to, it's terrible language, subject to predominantly subjective effects-based considerations and or give rise to internal effects. These are the points we talked about before. If your project looks like it's going to run into an issue on any of these grounds, I would be saying sit tight, stick with your design, wait for the transitional provisions to come in and lodge at that point, because then you get the benefit of the amendments. Another way to look at it, if you're unsure, I sort of thought to myself, well, if you haven't engaged a planner or a lawyer and you think it's going to be straightforward, if you're writing a big long design statement, not solely for the purpose of the client, but maybe to justify why something's been done or designed in the way it has been, that's probably a good example, a good indication that you're running into potentially running into a whole lot of visual amenity, character, view-based effects issues that are going to have to be dealt with at a consent stage. So again, likely best to sit tight on those for now. So what should architects be doing? Identify your regulatory pathway early. Are you going under the RMA? Are you under the transitional system, or are you under the new system? The new system's less relevant. That's still got a number of years to fully come in, but the transitional system is important. I would be identifying, recording and implementing your planning assumptions and your constraints as part of your design process at an early stage, particularly why you're doing something or why something is not relevant in terms of your design. And I say that because you may also end up in a scenario where I know the opposition parties have said one thing in terms of we're going to get what we get and we're going to keep it and we're not going to fully repeal the new law, but there could be a scenario in which some of these effects-based clauses and exclusions are amended, and what may happen is you end up in a situation where we have a sort of 4-week, 5-week period, depending on how long, again, a number of assumptions here, assuming a new government comes in, assuming they amend the law, you may end up with not 5 or 6 weeks, probably 2 or 3 months, where the transitional provisions have come in and then the law is amended, but for anything that's lodged within that 3-month period, it gets the benefit of the law as it applied at the time that happened. So having a record of what you've done and what you've designed at that point is going to be helpful. I would also suggest preserving some flexibility in designs. If you're committing to design details now for projects or buildings, and those design details have been committed to address an effect that is potentially no longer going to be relevant, you may be able to actually completely revise your design for benefit to a client. Put simply, ask which regime applies and how does it apply. And a number of you will work with planners or lawyers, I'm sure. Planning advice or legal advice will assist with that. Even a phone call to a planner or an environmental lawyer should be able to provide some clarity there. This is the process. It is going to take time. We're looking at 4 to 5 years before everything comes in. Again, this is borrowed from a ministry presentation a couple of weeks ago. I think based on the national direction document and discussion document that I highlighted earlier, I personally think the late 2026, mid 2028 timing for all of this national direction to pop out is ambitious, but there are timeframe requirements in the Act. Whether those get complied with, I don't know. Often it depends on how much capacity the public sector has down in Wellington and within the ministries to push these through. So just in conclusion, don't assume the new provisions will make projects easy. It will definitely assist, I think, for a number of your projects and a large proportion of the design work you do as architects. But there are still constraints that will be relevant. Keep a close eye on the transition and what's relevant to you and your sites and the jobs you're working on. It is a moving feast, and I mentioned there's guidance popping out of the ministry regularly. Everyone's coming up to speed with this at the same time. Identifying your relevant effects is critical. Know what's in and what's out, and let that inform your design. That's the one thing I can't stress enough. You need to know what effects are in and what effects are out under the transitional regime. And for those projects that are constrained by subjective amenity and design-related objections, they'll definitely benefit, I think, as a result of the changes. Look, it's not going to be to everyone's taste, particularly the effects exclusions. There has been fairly strong commentary on both sides, for and against, but this is where we've landed. I think it's going to be less work for architects, and I put an asterisk there because that was supposed to be an architect writing evidence, which architects usually hate doing. There's probably going to be more work for architects in terms of actually doing the things that architects do best, which is designing buildings and drawings. So, look, thank you very much. That was a fairly high-level overview. I'm obviously happy to take questions from anyone in the room or if they're online, and if we want to go into some further detail, we can do that as well. So thank you.
Sure, there are questions, comments.
Your comments as well.
I've got a few, but maybe we go to what's online.
Yeah, nothing online at the moment, but anyone in the room? I'll just work my way around.
Thanks for that. Well, one of the things that intrigued me reading the planning bill was that it made no mention of height. And I was going to ask you about all of the what we call bulk and location controls that currently exist, like height to boundary, yards, height. That all seemed to be just completely ignored.
That's my take at the moment. I struggle to see... I had actually thought about that the other day because I don't think you can realistically impose the height in relation to boundary or the building in relation to boundary guidelines. How do you impose those? I mean, when you have Clause 14, which excludes all of these relevant effects from consideration, because all of those standards are set up to address the effects that are now gone. Height, I think, may be a slightly different one, and maybe building in relation to boundary where it's on a public space because it's views from private property. And so there may be some wriggle room there, which is we will control height and building in relation to boundary or yard setback or whatever in relation to road frontages or reserves or parks and things like that, rather than when you've got just private properties abutting each other. But again, there seems to be an inconsistency there or a difficulty.
Kia ora, thanks for that really interesting presentation. I just have a query around the disregarding views from private property. I'm wondering, in your mind, to what extent do you think adjacent landowners might subvert the legal process and mediate an agreement between them anyway, which could preserve either one or both views?
There's nothing to stop that. I mean, it's regularly applied by developers, particularly in subdivisions. I don't know if you've done a lot of work. I mean, the common examples of just about every new subdivision in Central Otago or Queenstown has a whole lot of private covenants placed on titles to preserve views, restrict heights, place design constraints on new builds. And that won't change. There's nothing to stop it. We still run into legacy provisions up here, which are building line restrictions or view shaft restrictions that are private between property owners. So I think if you are developing if you're taking a large lot and developing a number of residential lots off it, and you're retaining a lot and you want to preserve everything, you're going to have to do it privately. But to be fair, that's no different to the use how private covenants are used now. I think they will gain some more prominence because you can't rely on the planning framework to do it for you. And it avoids the obvious one, which is sometimes the sum of money's paid to someone for a consequential effect.
Do you think it'll be easier under the new framework or harder for smaller operators to subdivide or develop land?
When you say smaller operator?
Like a mum and pop or something buying a paddock and then splitting it off into 2 or 3 lots? Or
I think
it's all going to at a higher level than national versus the...
The subdivision rules, as far as I can tell, aren't going to change a whole lot. It's rather the development-based rules as opposed to the subdivision that is the real tweak. I don't think it's going to make it more difficult in terms of those, or in fact, it'll probably make it easier in terms of those infill-type developments in existing urban areas. The reference like a farm or a rural area, again, these effects are excluded, but the same constraints that those areas have always had, particularly infrastructure, your 3 waters, roads, those constraints are still there. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be easier in that respect.
With the urban infill?
Urban infill, I think it will be, yeah.
Thanks, Chris. A number of the institutes, including the Landscape and Architecture Institutes, put submissions forward about the issue of landscape and the exclusion of landscape effects. Given that we all live in a landscape, has there been any definition of what actual landscape effects are excluded?
No, there was an amendment that came through. Not that I've seen. There was an amendment that came through to Clause 14 of the Planning Bill, which was the effects exclusion provisions, and that was changed from, I think the previous wording was exclusion of landscape effects, and they've changed it to outstanding natural landscapes and high natural character areas. I'd check that, but I think they've actually narrowed it. So some landscape effects will still be relevant, I presume, in response to...
Well, just to follow on, it goes to what Graham was saying about can you actually impose any of those controls to control anything?
Yeah, I mean,
it's a landscape, and buildings are part of landscape, landscape's part of landscape, water's part of landscape. There's a whole lot of,
I mean, then you end up in a
big circle.
Well, I was going to say in a discussion around, is the enjoyment and perception of a landscape, I mean, that's more of a public rather than a private effect. I don't know if you'd agree with that characterisation, but so can we still put those controls in terms of, well, it's deemed to be a public effect or a view from a public place, and so you can deal with it that way? The answer is I don't know for certain, but it is a live issue. You have an inherent tension between the controls we're used to, the effects that are excluded, and then how a new set of controls, I think, is brought in to both cover what the system's intended to cover, but without falling foul of those effects exclusions. That'll be debated throughout the plan change process, I'm sure.
Hey, we seem to be in a bit of a situation where anything of great scale or significance seems to be going through the fast track process, even if you've got to truck your wastewater off-site. Can you talk a bit about how this will intersect with the fast track stuff that we're seeing at the moment?
I'm involved in the fast track processes at the moment. I must confess I haven't closely reviewed how that process will be amalgamated into the new planning and environment bills. I'd have to go away and look at it. We're still under an existing separate statute for that, but I'm not sure what the intention is in terms of bringing that into the new legislation. Sorry, we've mainly been focusing on the current legislation for that. As I mentioned at the start, one aspect that I haven't been able to get across. I know there's a few petitions floating around at the moment, though, but that's just from news articles to prevent fast-track projects from going forward.
We've gone through quite a chaotic approach to getting here and getting through to the Plan Change 120. Plan Change 120 is going back into hearings. Is there any impact that this Act will have on Plan Change 120 and the provisions in it that control height and things like that and the zoning?
Yes, I think it will, but it probably goes to some of the earlier questions around are those controls now relating to an effect that is gone from consideration under the new law? I would have to check, but I think there is a mechanism which is quite common whereby that's been built into the new bills, which is when the law changes, a council can come along and essentially remove and update and modify and amend provisions in its existing plan to take those out without going through a further Schedule 1 process. So anything that's inconsistent will just be taken out. And that's happened before with some of the provisions, particularly in the AUP. But in terms of 120 specifically, I think the height points will be relevant. Any of those design controls will be relevant. All the hazard stuff that's in there, I don't think that's going to be affected by the changes.
And setting the stuff at the national level, was that including the number of zones that are applicable and the rules for those zones?
Yes, it will. It will provide some prescriptive rules for those. There's going to be exceptions, I think, and again, I'd have to go and check the detail, but there's some exceptions in which there is the ability to depart from the prescriptive standards, but the idea is that you have some national direction. It sets it up, and you have to implement it. Otherwise, to be fair, we're going back to the existing process. So that's really the change. Yeah.
Just a bit further on Plan Change 120, would you say that it is a spatial plan? And the reason I ask is that when you look at Drury, as you did there, it's reasonably easy to say what a spatial plan there would look like. But what would a spatial plan of Epsom look like, for instance? You know, how does a spatial plan work on an existing urban area?
Well, I'm only speaking to... Usually your spatial plans won't, again in my experience, they won't come through and... That's all right. It's concrete floor, it's no problem. They'll come through and direct change to particularly your greenfields type areas and your areas that you are to develop as opposed to your existing urban areas. Those controls would more come through just the normal plan change process rather than a spatial plan.
Nonetheless, there's a requirement on everyone to produce a spatial plan.
There is, and so you could still have a spatial plan, I think, that comes through and does. I mean, Auckland's a good example because it's developed from, out west to way out east, and you could have a spatial plan that comes through and does identify parts of the urban area that are designed for intensification or upzoning or major infrastructure works, and that's done at a spatial planning level, and then there's less scope to challenge that when their upzoning actually does come through, i.e. what we're going through at the moment. So again, that spatial planning level is quite critical. So yes, but not to the same extent. Yeah.
So over the next 5 years, or 18 months or so, they'll be developing those spatial plans. Is there anything to say that it won't be a copy paste of the Auckland Unitary Plan or the Plan Change 120 as a starting point? Like it could be that, but then just with no window constraints or some of those other amenity things.
It could be. I mean, it's going to be up to councils.
And then it's a consolidating of the zones, so there's a consistency across New Zealand. For sort of this is a urban, so you could still have the same areas of intensity. And
I've looked at it as saying, well, you've devolved. This is how I view it, which is you've taken some of that devolved decision making at a local level because of the prescriptive zones and standards, etc. But that local level decision making, the chance to do that is now at the spatial planning stage rather than the subsequent plan change stage. So that's where the key drivers of how a region wants to develop and grow, etc. etc.
Still consult with the national government.
Yeah, there's going to be but there's a level of regional decision making. This is all sort of semi tied up with the local government reforms as well, which I don't profess to be across those amalgamations of councils and how we deal with all of that, because local government's going through a bit of a sea change right now as well. The big thing coming out, particularly in respect of these two bills, and you will have seen it in the news, it's not directly relevant to today's presentation, but it's that whole idea of regulatory relief, where if a council comes in and imposes again, it kind of goes back to the private. It does go back to the private property rights. If a council comes in and imposes a constraint on your land, then there's a mechanism by which that private landowner can obtain regulatory relief from local government because they've been restricted in how they can use their land. And councils are going, well, we don't have the money for that. And you can think about a small council. There's numerous examples in the South Island where they have huge geographical areas and frankly, not a large number of ratepayers, but they're going to have to deal with it because that's what's coming in.
I'm just trying to get my head around the merging and the meshing. So you've got the high level, the spatial planning, and the broad vision, and then somewhere below, councils are going to be operating, and they've got to meet standard and code requirements. So there will be requirement for orientation rooms, ventilation, all that sort of stuff. Somewhere that has to merge. So it sounds like there's almost a free range, of what could be done because you disregard all those elements. And the height is not talked about, but at some point, will not council still have to talk about boundary relationship, height to boundary, daylight, all those things that filter down. Otherwise, you've got to filter everything down through to your prescriptive codes that you can do what you wish.
Yes. And it's a good point, particularly the reference to the Building Act, because it's one thing to say that a number of these effects will fall by the wayside, but then you have a whole lot of building codes, design codes, and a plethora of standards, that come through. So I think you'll just end up at a point where all of these effects are gone from a consenting pathway, but you're still looking at design under the Building Act and code pathway and the prescriptive standards that apply under those other pieces of legislation. There is I don't have my copy in front of me. There is a clause in Section 14 which talks about the exclusion of effects where they are addressed or controlled or provided for by other legislation. Sorry, I haven't quoted that word for word, but I skimmed over it when I read it. But I think it's addressing that, designed to maybe try and address that issue, which is to the extent there's any other piece of legislation, i.e. the Building Act or the Building Code, that prescribes something, then it's gone from consideration under the RMA and you consider it under the alternative act, or not the alternative act, the other act or the other code. It doesn't make life easier for a council because they have to deal with all of these different things. But that's, to be fair, no different, I don't think, to how it works today.
Yeah.
You still need, it just reduces a layer of complexity out of the RMA. But it doesn't matter what you do under the RMA, you still have to comply with the Building Act, get your building consent, comply with your design standards under that. So,
Yeah.
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 Any other questions?
Possibly reasonably straightforward, but the exclusion of...
Usually a question that starts with that, isn't
well,
it?
maybe not. The exclusion of character effects, obviously in central Auckland especially, we have these special character overlays. Is that character, or is that a matter of historic heritage, which will be upheld?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Or unsure?
I'll just be quite careful with how I word this. Based on the intent behind the legislation, I would probably say there's potentially an interpretation that historic heritage doesn't relate to the idea of a character overlay more broadly. It relates to tagged and identified heritage buildings or features rather than a broad swath of... So, no, but happy to be challenged on that one. I think that's probably a scope for a future argument.
Sure.
Yeah.
No further questions. Yeah, thank you very much. That's
An absolute pleasure.
That's really great.
I just to reiterate some comments I made at the start, it really is a sea change. I assume that everyone here is fairly familiar with particularly the unitary plan and the alternative provisions on Waiheke and the island Hauraki Gulf Islands plans, but this really is a change to how we interpret and apply the law. As lawyers, we're looking at it. There's going to be, I personally think, a number of interpretive arguments around how this new law is applied, particularly in terms of the goals and the principles that don't have defined hierarchies, how the effects that are to be excluded, picking up on a couple of the questions that we've had tonight, how they are to be interpreted and applied, and what are the four corners of those effects to exclude them from consideration. And then there's obviously going to be a huge discussion around, some of those earlier questions around, do these provisions relate to an effect that's in or effect that's out? And those are all live issues that are going to have to be discussed. I don't want to say litigated, I'll just say discussed because it's council hearing level, and resolved. But this is why I've always said the RMA is a complex beast, but the interplay between the various aspects of the environment and the urban and the natural environment and the built environment, it always has a trade-off in some way, shape or form. We've swung the trade-off, I think, as a result of this law one way, or a bit further in one direction.
Have we got examples internationally of legislation that's quite similar to what we've got in front of us now? Or are we being a pilot who's supplementing that?
I don't know the answer to that. The Australian, naturally for the reason that I don't tend to deep dive into the legislation of other countries that frequently, Australia runs a semi-similar system to us, our existing RMA. I don't know the extent to which, because they have obviously the various states. So I don't know the extent to which state and federal government and things interrelate, or whether they can have a national direction that overlays what states are doing, because they still have, I think, I'm not sure what they call their councils in Australia, but similar to the district and regional councils we have here. Whether their national direction type system looks similar to what we're proposing here, the answer is I'm not sure. Yeah, but the system's fairly similar to the RMA, as I understand it.
So I wonder, Graham or Richard, would urban design panels still exist in the longer term? You know, you'd be just talking about different things.
Yeah, that's a really open question. I can't answer that, but the whole future of urban design as a thing is a work in progress, isn't it? Because the planning bill as written appears to rule out any kind of overall consideration of urban form. I think it's really disappointing, all the submissions that various bodies have made over the last years, both to the Labour effort and now the national effort, that there hasn't been a more bipartisan approach to an enduring piece of legislation. I think this is actually going to be litigated for years to come, as was the RMA. It hasn't solved anything, in my view.
Yeah, it's speaking from a legal perspective. I mean, again, a personal view, but it's one of the most critical pieces of legislation that we have in terms of New Zealand. I mean, other lawyers will argue with me about that, but in terms of how we develop, grow, and just operate as a country, the point you made about bipartisan support, I mean, it frustrates me personally that we can't get some agreement going on this. That is the, again, I want to be speaking out of turn, that is the purpose of the select committee process. You have a whole lot of MPs from different parties sitting around a select committee table. There's been arguments, I think, by various commentators that select committees truly bipartisan these days. Don't know, but we seem to have ended up we've shifted into a slightly more adversarial system as the years have gone on in terms of national government.
All right. Adam?
It seems to me that the whole process, even with Plan Change 120 and the new RMA, is kind of pushing to generate greater density and build, which is fine. But there isn't anything in either of those that controls the quality of the outcome. And it seems to me there's a risk here in long term for the country and also our suburbs and our cities that it's going to be driven by the lowest common denominator of the developer. And there's nothing in place, I think, that I can see in any of those that's going to control that or put something in place to like either steer it in a slightly better direction or put the brakes on something. It's just go, go, go with no control. And I think it runs on to Graham's discussion about the fact that urban design is now out the window. And I think even under Plan Change 120, if I'm correct, I would need to check it, that there's a situation where in special character zones, those character zone controls are now gone.
Yeah, I was having a discussion, I think it was Rich earlier, which is we sort of seem to have reached a point when the RMA first came in back in, I mean, if you look at a resource consent, for example, or a transitional plan that came from the Town and Country Planning Act through to the RMA back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, plans were straightforward, not many rules, fairly permissive. Resource consents you could have quite complex resource consent decisions that are written on 2 pieces of paper, as opposed to the 100 pages of conditions you get for a massive project these days. Again, there's arguments for and against that, but early on, I think that lack of constraint over time developed into the point you're making, which is we want some control over the type of development and what it looks like, and that's slowly become more and more granular as the years have gone on. And now we've almost just, the table's flipped, and we've decided actually that's not what we want anymore. I say we, but we're all subject to the whims of government. We're a democracy, and we've decided to go back in the opposite direction. It's really, to my mind, a bit of a shift back to what the RMA perhaps was, or even sometimes the Town and Country Planning Act was, back in the late 70s and the 80s. But I mean, the philosophical question, do we want to control where things go and what they look like? Some people will say yes, some people will say no. But at the moment, it really is down to the individual property owner.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of international models where that's been thrown out, and where they've gone, we don't want any controls, we just got to get it done, get it built, and there've been, disasters as a result of it, and you don't have to look too far to find it.
Yeah.
And we were in a very good position probably, I don't know, about 10, 20 years ago, where we could have really been a world leader in what we were wanting to generate in our communities and in our cities, and we're slowly losing it, and it's a worry.
Well, it's funny you cite 10. Did you say 10 to 12 years ago?
10 to 20.
10 to 20. Sorry. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and I'm going back here, the first major change to the RMA, and I say major like a wholesale reform, I think was proposed in 2013. I can't remember which government was in at the time, but it was all due to come in completely up sticks, and I think the minister, and then they suddenly lost the majority to push the amendment through, push the change through, so it all fell over. It sort of they might have been tossed it after that, so then we ended up with a couple of election cycles of sort of minor tweaking again, and then it was all back on the agenda with the NBEA, and then obviously that got thrown. That came in literally 2 months before the election. Then the national government came in, said, no, we don't want that, repealed that thing, and then has now brought this in. So this is a reflection of, I mean, these changes that have happened over the last 10 years, 15 years are a reflection of political cycles, fundamentally, I think. But that goes back to the bipartisan point as well.
That's where the logic of the New Zealand Infrastructure's manifesto, where you've got a 12-year term. I don't know if you saw anything, but hopefully everyone in the room has. But, that sort of thing really does need to come into action. Because this ping-ponging is just ridiculous. It's stuffing the country up.
And it's something NZI has been pushing for a while now, because obviously it's one thing to, I mean, it's all very well, designing and saying we want this development here and we want that there, but if you don't fundamentally have the infrastructure to support it, that was kind of my response to your question earlier, which is it may make some developments easier, but at the end of the day, if there's still a major infrastructure constraint.
Well, it manages the political side of it as well.
And it's, I mean, I'm less across the granular detail of that, but my understanding is that's got tied up a little bit in the local government reforms and issues at the moment as well. It's hard to have a long-term cycle for planning infrastructure when local government uncertainty is a live issue. Yeah. Yeah, and some countries do it well, and a number of countries you look at, but then, I mean, the Swedish one's a good one because there are some, I mean, but they're both island nations, similar to us.
That's right. Similar size, similar scale, just doing it far better.
Yeah, Ireland in particular.
And back to what Mark was saying, we've got a great opportunity and we're just stuffing it up continually.
Yeah. So, I mean, to be frank, enabling, you can tweak the RMA all you want, but you have to deal with, I think you have to deal with I think we've got issues with the Building Act at the moment. It's not an area I practice in, but that's become more and more detailed, good or bad. There's amendments that have been proposed, and then you have the infrastructure as well, which is another major.
I find it very ironic that New Zealand is, 90% urban? We live in cities and towns, and yet the key guiding legislation, the planning bill that affects cities and towns, almost throws everything out the window around achieving towns and cities that we want to love and enjoy. Where's that, the whole public realm concept that comes with that is out the window, and there's a real risk of just living in literally shoeboxes looking at a blank wall of another shoebox, and that's fine. And I think it does worry me where that's going.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer to that, apart from to say that that is correct, that's the change. The outcome of that, I wouldn't stand here and say exactly what it's going to look like.
The argument to that is that the public realm is that the civic spaces are still under control of civic leaders and the shaping of.
But can you control the edges of those spaces, the houses, the apartments, the factories?
Yes, anything that's
public realm.
Yeah.
I agree. And in fact, that's what the urban design panel came in because of the Conrad apartments, I think, down Nelson Street. People said we don't have our city to look like that. And we do have to worry about our city because we've got to compete as a place for attraction at the international level. So I think
you just take Auckland. It's an amazing city, an amazing setting, and it really has got a great opportunity to be a wonderful world city. Yet we could destroy that very quickly.
Well, you rely on your public land. You rely on the council to do the right thing by that land, and that's a council-led discussion. But
private land includes the streets. 30% of the city are public streets.
Yeah.
And if all the development turns its back on it, what sort of a city does that give us?
Yeah, that's the issue. Is private land now. So.
But also the national government's getting far too involved in local times, and that's kind of stopping that.
Yeah, again, I guess it goes both ways. Some people are for it and some people are against it.
Is it not for architects as designers to give examples of how to do things really well, to give a vision for others, and then let them, dare I say it, the thrust of the parties behind this change would say that the market should decide what is good and bad development, and if there's enough good development, then nobody will want to go into the bad development. So then the developer that develops the bad apartment goes bankrupt, and the developer that develops the really good apartment makes a heap of money and then can do another 3.
Let's hope so.
I think regrettably, this government at the moment is not that supportive of architects. They've openly stated we don't need award-winning, and it's a really big thing for the Institute of Architects to stand up and really, really push the politicians and push what we are all about as architects, because it's just being run over, we need to be stronger.
I think that's the role of the Institute.
Yes.
And it wasn't that long ago where the previous government were looking at abolishing architects and just everyone's going to be an LPBB.
Yeah.
So,
So, you look at international cities where architects are valued and they're phenomenal. And here, we've got great opportunity, and yet it's a time when we should really be not being put up on a pedestal, but being very supported to create great things instead of the cheapest possible option that's there. And it's this, value for money. What is value for money? It's not the cheapest thing now. It is, the value for money is what you're setting up for the future. I'll have a drink, but I smashed my glass. But the stem is standing, that's what it's saying.
That's all right, nothing wrong with that.
An act of disgust.
But passionate,
Yeah, I think we should let Chris go and back to his family. But I'd really like to thank you for that.
That's all right. What's that?
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Chris.
No, thank you for having me.
Good session. Good
Yep.
conversation.
Thanks everyone for attending. If you need to claim your CPD points, there's a form just there to fill that out. If you're attending online, there's a link in the chat. Other than that, that's it for tonight. Thank you everyone for coming. I don't really know how